Once again, thank you very much for joining us. This is the IEU Virtual Talk. And the IEU's Virtual Talks are a space where we feature experts and leaders in the international arena. And they are a great venue for dialogue, exchange, and learning. We use this opportunity to increase understanding about the independent evaluation unit of the Green Climate Fund and then the GCF overall, but also raising awareness about the diverse learnings and streams of learning and voices outside the GCF and IEU as well. And so we are very happy that you are with us today. So today's talk, the topic is results-based payments. What does the evidence say? And today we have two speakers from Mathematica, Dr. Tulika Narayan and Dr. Faraz Usmani. And so we are very happy to have these two speakers with us. And the IEU's very own Dr. Martin Prowse will serve as our discussant for this talk. And these three speakers that we have today, they actually contributed to the IEU's recently concluded evidence review on the topic of RBPs. So yes, this paper is now available on our website, and you can simply scan the QR code and you will have the paper at your fingertips. So we will hear from the speakers what were the key lessons learned from this recent evidence review that's been completed. Really briefly on today's program. So after my introduction, we will go straight into the presentation by Dr. Narayan and Dr. Usmani for about 20 minutes. And then we will have a 5-minute intervention by Dr. Martin Prowse of the IEU. And towards the end, we will do an open Q&A that's moderated. And so you're welcome to send your questions to us through the Zoom box. And then we will try to answer many questions as possible at the end. But if you want to ask a question directly to any of the speakers, then you're welcome to use the raise hand button during the Q&A, and I will give you the floor. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, some housekeeping. Please ensure that your mic is muted when you are not speaking, and especially during the presentation by the speakers, so that we don't disrupt them. And as I mentioned, you're welcome to send us your questions via the Zoom chat box. And you can tweet about today's talk during and after the event. And the IEU's handle is @GCF_eval. And then the event hashtag is #IEU Talks. Next, please. So yes, I have the honor of introducing today's speakers. First of all, Dr. Tulika Narayan. She's Director of Food Security and Agriculture at Mathematica. She is an agriculture and development economist with 15 years of experience. She conducts economic analysis to support agricultural development, climate change, low emissions development, and environmental policy. And Dr. Faraz Usmani, he is research economist at Mathematica. He's an environmental economist with research interests at the intersection of environment, energy, and development. And he has over 10 years of experience in evaluating the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of development interventions. Also, Dr. Martin Prowse, he's our evaluation specialist at the IEU, and he is currently applying his 15 years of work experience in international development to support the IEU's work streams on impact evaluation, evidence reviews, and behavioral science. He has published widely, and he's also an editor of the European Journal of Development Research. All right, so without further ado, I will now invite Dr. Narayan and Dr. Usmani to please walk us through their presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yunji, and thank you so much to IEU and GCF for inviting us for the talk, and also for embarking us on this really interesting journey to learn about results-based payments. It was particularly exciting for me to work on this coming off as a research director for Ag Results, which was exploring the use of pull mechanisms to increase agriculture technology adoption. And I also want to thank all my co-authors in collaboration with Martin, Peter, Lang, Emma, Anu, Josh, and William. Go to the next slide. Just to give you a roadmap of how the presentation will go, we'll talk a little bit about the vision and objectives. Why did we embark on this work? The technical approach, the results, and then some insights. Next slide. And just to outline the overall vision and objective, the evidence review was focused very much on understanding the landscape and the lay of the land. Where does the evidence lie in which sector on RBPs? It hasn't gotten quite as far as to understand the actual magnitude of their impact, whether it was efficacious, what was the cost effectiveness, and those are all interesting topics for research, which I'll also lay at the end of the presentation. So the next slide. The motivation for this, of course, comes from, an agreement that climate change is perhaps the most defining policy challenge. And I'm sure a lot of you in the audience hold that view, and certainly is a big part of the charter for GCF. And yet the pace of climate action is slow, and it is sort of very intrinsically tied to the public goods nature of climate mitigation, where it's sort of hard to incur costs and be guaranteed the benefits will accrue directly to you. So there's the externality that frustrates concerted action and coordination that is needed for climate change. So next slide. And on the other hand, there is results-based payment, which from a theoretical underpinning seems to hold the challenge for addressing some of these externalities and the misaligned incentives. Because in RBPs, the funding is paid upon achievement of predefined outcomes. So you could define an outcome which is a climate-related outcome and be guaranteed your outcome will occur. And in that way, it helps align incentives. And because you're focusing on outcomes, it increases accountability. And not only that, if you particularly put agents in competition, it can also foster innovation and creativity, because nobody tells you how to get to that point. They're just only focused on that particular outcome. And often it can also crowd in more resources, particularly imagine situations where you have RBPs and multiple actors and everybody does not get the prize, but you get the effort of all the multiple actors. So it brings in resources. If you get private sector engaged, then you can get private sector investment to invest in outcomes you're interested in, for example, supply chains for climate smart solutions. And they have a very interesting, a array of RBPs that vary incentive structure that could help tailor the outcomes and help tailor what the whole system may look like at the end. There are differences in whether you bring multiple actors together or single. You can have differences, degrees of competition and risk among actors, which can affect who actually comes and participate in the program. But also how many participate in the program. And then, of course, they can vary in the types of actions you incentivize and the types of actors. So with that backdrop, let's go to the next slide. Overall, given that sort of theoretical excitement about the RBP, the objective of this work is to take stock of the global evidence base on RBPs across all sectors. And across all sectors, because that evidence could be valuable in informing applications to the climate space. And then we also look at the degree to which GCF thus far has used RBPs, and then based on that, identify opportunities for GCF to either use them for interventions or to deploy evaluations of existing RBP mechanisms in the climate space. So next slide. To inform the evidence review and to ground it, we first started with a meta theory of change, which is in the next slide. So the first thing we did, if you look to the left, we organized the RBP interventions into three broad categories. So first is the set of RBP interventions that are focused on the supply side, which means it's incentivizing the supply of goods and services. And there are different mechanisms from grand challenges all the way down to pay for performance that you can use, which vary in the degree of competition, whether it's a multiple agent or a single agent a competition, and how it incentivizes the actors. On all the way down to the below is the demand side RBPs, such as conditional cash transfer, that are focused fundamentally on the demand itself and the act of, say, adopting a technology or consuming the good or services. In the middle, the hybrid is the interesting set of RBPs that simultaneously influence supply and demand, although are typically focused on the supply side. For example, incentivizing sale of a good or services. So if you're going to make a payment based on sale, you're already also incentivizing the adoption because somebody has to purchase it. So pull mechanisms and vouchers fall in that category. So what these different types of array of interventions then does is it alters the incentives of the agents and alters them to achieve the outcomes that you want them to achieve. And they're typically not in the output realm, they're in the interim, sustained, or even final outcome realm. So you can define which one you want to pin it on. And then which route they take across the output, interim, and sustained outcomes can be completely up to them. So it's a very interesting sort of further research question on, well, what types of innovations came up in new theories of change that the agents deployed, which ones are more effective so they could be even applied to more traditional mechanisms. So those are very interesting questions. Which incentive structure, what pathways incentivize which pathways? And so if you sort of incentivize them, say at a interim outcome level, then your theory of change suggests that you will get to a final outcome in different health sector, whether it's agriculture, education, or energy. For example, for payment for environmental services, you often incentivize certain actions around conservation, perhaps, and then that would lead to environmental outcomes. That's all listed in the darker green box to the right. Now, another interesting feature of the RBPs is that it can lead to some system level impacts. For example, in pull mechanisms, when you are incentivizing an actor to supply a good and services, presumably you're obviously doing it in an area where there's a market failure. In the process of trying to achieve that outcome, they can make investments, say, in distribution networks and supply chains that can, in the end, result in, say, a well-functioning market for that good or services. So that's a huge system level impact. There could also be other influences like policy reform. All the while, we have to be watchful of the unintended consequences. For example, RBPs focused on private sector may not focus on the poorest of the poor immediately. There could be other influences on equity. For example, grand challenges could motivate monopolistic pricing because you're just giving an award to an entity that created a technology, but it's only one entity, so there could be monopolistic pricing. And then finally, all the way down below is the underlying assumptions about the enabling environment, because RBPs require verification, which requires a certain level of governance and reporting mechanisms that can be implemented in a space, and there has to be policy support and so forth. So with that background of a meta theory of change across RBPs and how they might influence outcome, we get into the specific technical approach, for which I'll hand it over to Faraz. Over to you, Faraz, and the next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Tulika. Next slide, please. So to really begin to operationalize the big picture meta theory of change that Tulika was just describing, the relationship between specific interventions and final outcomes, we essentially needed to start by delineating our inclusion and exclusion criteria. And to do so, we relied on something called the PCOS approach. The key elements of the PCOS approach are listed on your screen right now. And these help us limit the scope, so to speak, of the particular evidence review search that we hope to operationalize. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about each element of the PCOS approach, but I do want to point out three distinct factors. First is that we looked at three different regional groupings. We looked at non-Annex 1 countries, that essentially translates into low and middle income countries across the world. We looked at low income contexts in Annex 1 countries, so low income settings in relatively wealthy nations, as well as global or regional studies that offered that separately reported results for the two. The second thing I wanted to point out is that we cast a fairly wide net. We didn't limit our search by sector, and we didn't limit our search by the type of outcome or the type of actor that a particular study or publication was looking at. And then finally, we cast a wide net in terms of the type of study we were looking at as well. Although we looked exclusively at quantitative results, we didn't restrict our search to only causal designs. We also ensured that evidence of non-causal work was being represented. I'd like to highlight one additional point. for conditional cash transfers, a specific type of RBP intervention for which we're aware that there's already a large evidence base out there, we relied on systematic reviews that existed currently rather than looking at individual studies. And I'll show you how this fit into our results framework later. Next slide, please. And so to take those inclusion-exclusion criteria and to actually then operationalize a search, we started with Scopus, which is a fairly large database of academic publications. I encourage you to take a look at our learning paper to actually see the exact search terms that we deployed in Scopus for those who are looking to replicate our search, modify or extend our search, and build on this work. Well, with those results in hand, we then modified our search and deployed it in a set of custom search engines that also allowed us to search for gray literature publications coming out from a sample of over 1,200 global think tanks. We conducted hand searches of selected systematic review repositories and made sure that each of these studies that we were finding was reviewed comprehensively by a team of multiple coders and screeners. Next slide, please. And so this figure just summarizes the overall results of our search. You'll see that the three different databases that we were looking for through the three different sources of these evidence resulted in approximately 1,600 individual studies being found. After our comprehensive review to ensure that we were looking at the relevant evidence that is germane to the goals and objectives that Tulika highlighted in the beginning, we ended up with over 400 individual studies highlighting over 1,700 distinct relationships between specific RBP interventions and specific outcomes that they sought to incentivize improvements for. Next slide, please. And so with that, let me turn to results. Next slide. The key component of our learning paper is this evidence gap map, which essentially gives you a sense of the landscape on RBPs as Tulika was highlighting originally. Next slide. And so the intervention outcome framework, the relationship between specific RBP interventions and specific distinct outcomes that emerges from our meta theory of change is operationalized most effectively in the evidence gap map that you see here. The first column lists individual RBP interventions that we were looking for. And across the top, you have distinct specific outcomes separated by types of actors that they were hoping, the types of actor categories that they fall into. Each cell in this evidence gap map represents a distinct relationship between a specific intervention and a specific outcome. So I mentioned that we find 1,700 pieces of evidence this way. The distribution of this evidence across the evidence gap map tells us where the evidence base might be relatively deep and where evidence might be lacking. It's worth noting what the evidence gap map also doesn't do. This is not a meta-analysis. So as you can see, the evidence gap map doesn't provide insights, for example, about the effectiveness of RBP interventions in a particular domain or the direction of the relationship between an intervention or an outcome. It's also worth highlighting, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the row on conditional cash transfers, as CCTs, summarizes evidence only from systematic reviews. So as you kind of scan across these numbers to see where the evidence is relatively deep, don't be misled by the fact that the numbers in CCTs might be perhaps lower, because a systematic review can ultimately summarize dozens, if not hundreds of studies. It's important to keep that in context. And so next slide, please. Three key lessons emerge from the evidence gap map that I showed you. The first is that much of the relevant scholarship that we do find, much of the relevant scholarship that fits the inclusion-exclusion criteria that we delineated for the study emerges from RBPs deployed in the form of vouchers. And these are especially common in the health sector. We also found that pay-for-performance mechanisms and payments for environmental services and conditional cash transfers were relatively frequently used. At the same time, we found key gaps emerging in the scholarship for certain mechanisms, for example, grand challenges, that are used extensively in the policy domain, but don't seem to have a lot of evidence studying the ways in which they influence final outcomes. We also found that RBPs have been widely used to incentivize beneficiary sector-specific improvements across different sectors. This suggests that the evidence on RBPs is not, for example, limited to particular sector, and that there is this potential to deploy RBPs, to tractably deploy RBPs across different domains. Finally, we also found that the scale of the intervention was closely related to the type of RBP that was being deployed. Conditional cash transfer, for example, we found were often used to target very specific consumption of very specific goods and services by distinct groups of end users, whereas payments for environmental services often target system-wide environmental outcomes, such as emissions reductions and deforestation. Next slide, please. And so how can we then situate the GCF's effort within that same intervention outcome framework? To do that, we first took stock of the fact that between 2015 and 2020, the GCF had committed over $7 billion through nearly 160 projects. How much of this had been committed through results-based payments? To begin to get a sense of that, we conducted a detailed review of 15 GCF projects, totaling, which entailing a commitment of over $500 million that used results-based modalities. Now, it's worth pointing out that this need not represent the universe of GCF projects that use RBPs, but it does represent a substantial shift. For each of these projects, we studied closely the type of incentive mechanism they deployed, the type of outcomes they were using, that they were hoping to incentivize, as well as the expected beneficiaries of each of those projects. This essentially generated a data set which we used to populate an intervention heat map. Next slide, please. An intervention heat map essentially does what the evidence gap map does with the evidence that is being extracted from publications in the relevant literature, but for a portfolio of projects and funding. Next slide. And here we see that same intervention outcome framework emerge yet again. Now, each cell, instead of representing a count of the evidence being reported in publications, is a dollar amount. And so one key lesson jumps at you right away is that of that $529 million that the GCF had committed through results-based modalities, nearly all of it had been committed using payments for environmental services modalities to incentivize system-wide deforestation outcomes. In fact, this amount had primarily been allocated through the GCF's RED Plus pilot program, which rewards countries for demonstrated emissions reductions through reduced deforestation. That said, at the same time, non-trivial amounts had also been allocated to incentivize sector-specific beneficiary outcomes, particularly through voucher-based and conditional cash transfer-based mechanisms as well. So with that, next slide. With that, I'll turn it back to Tulika for some insights that emerge.
Thank you. You can go to the next slide. So just very briefly, I mean, on the left are, the evidence that Faraz quickly summarized, and just a few interesting insights that emerge vis-a-vis what we set out to do is clearly there is potential to grow the RBP approaches within the GCF portfolio. Of course, that will require some additional review, meta-analysis to understand where and how the impacts are. But there are a variety of other RBP interventions that are ongoing in other sectors. Another interesting insight is that the PES mechanism so far, for example, in GCF has focused primarily on outcomes that are related squarely in the environment and climate space, but there may be opportunities to also target the co-benefits that result from it, say pollution reduction and other things, which could also invigorate more investment and excitement around it. And there's also potential to incentivize service providers, which has not been the focus thus far in GCF interventions. And broadly, I would say that focus on unintended consequences, understanding that, and prospective analysis when embarking on this work to assess what the role could be of different incentive structures would be quite interesting and important. Next slide. which is our last slide, which I want to definitely close on the idea of, here's what we found and what's next. So it'll be interesting to look back at this literature, which has research, which has been pretty exhaustive, to understand which RBPs have been more effective in which sector and which incentive structures. And also, what are the pathways of achieving final outcomes? What are the innovations that have emerged, which have been most effective? And what contextual factors have been critical in influencing the results. And this last piece was particularly one of the big things that came out of our AgResults work was the policy environment had a huge impact on RBP's success or failure. So these are the three potential further learning that's feasible. And with that, I would close and hand it over to Martin, and look forward to more questions from all of you.
Thank you very much, Tulika and Faraz, for that insightful presentation. So we will now invite Martin to give his intervention, and I think he wants to bring these findings into the GCF context a little more. So Martin, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yunji, and thank you very much, Tulika and Faraz, for an excellent presentation, and also for an excellent learning paper. Through the collaboration with the IEU, along with your colleague Josh, as Emma, Ilang, Peter, and Joe from the IEU, William and Anu. So it's been a great collaboration, and this is a great opportunity to hear more about the learning paper, and also to sort of embed it a bit in the GCF portfolio. Next slide, please. So there are three questions that I'd like to pose, and really just to sort of precipitate discussion from the floor and questions from the floor to Tulika and Faraz. So firstly, just around the population for the study, secondly, about broadening towards adaptation, and thirdly, just around directly incentivizing service providers. Next slide, please. So the first question just focuses on the relevance of evidence from low-income areas in developed countries to developing countries. The second question just focuses on how the GCF can broaden its existing results-based payment commitments in payment for environmental services to projects within adaptation. And thirdly, what are the best ways that the GCF can directly incentivize service providers? Next slide, please. So in the evidence review, we found that a quarter of the literature on RBPs was documented evidence from North America, followed by East Asia and the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So the first question is, how relevant is the documented evidence from developed countries, such as North America, for developing countries? And then what lessons can be from these studies can be applied in other contexts? So it'd be good to get a response to that. Next slide, please. The second question focuses on broadening RBPs within the GCF context to adaptation. So we find that the RBP literature that was covered, around half of it was in the health sector, and the rest is about 50% in the health sector. The rest of the evidence base was spread between agriculture and forestry, around 20%, and education, about 15%, and other sectors. And when we look at the sectoral breakdown, because in the annex to the learning paper we have some fantastic resources, which are the breakdown of the evidence gap map by sector and also by agents, by beneficiaries. So it's an extremely useful resource. And when we look at the sectoral EGMs within agriculture and forestry, we see that most of the studies within agriculture and forestry focus on payment for environmental services. Next slide, please. However, when we look at the GCF portfolio for adaptation projects, what we find is that we've got a portfolio of about 107 projects, and the sector that's most well represented is the water sector. After that, it's climate information and early warning systems, and the sector which follows that is agriculture, improving crops and food security. So the question here is, to what extent, next slide, please. So The findings from the evidence gap map suggest that the evidence base on results-based payment is actually very thin for some of the key sectors that the GCF is focusing on within its adaptation portfolio. For example, within the water sector, for climate information systems, early warning systems. So it'd be good to get reflections on that. And more broadly, what lessons can be learned from the health and education sectors and payment for environmental services to inform the GCF's adaptation portfolio. Next slide, please. And then the final question is around directly incentivizing service providers. So the GCF has a whole range of financial modalities on which it engages accredited entities through, including grants, loans, equity investments, guarantees. But there are also two results-based payment modalities. Performance-based payment modalities are within the GCF's locker, so to speak, as well as advanced market commitments, which are also a feature of the evidence gap map. And when we look at the breakdown of the evidence gap map in terms of the agents, the results-based payment agents, we see that there are very, very few studies, in fact, no studies that are using an advanced market commitment, but payment for performance, this form of results-based payments, there's a very, very thick and deep evidence base there. So the question there is, based on this evidence review, should the GCF focus much more on performance-based payments and pay for performance, as opposed to, for example, using advanced market commitments, which are also within its range of instruments, alongside payment for environmental services and the RED Plus pilot. Next slide. So those are the three questions. It's just, the aim is to try and kick a debate and discussion. So on that note, I'll thank you again, Faraz and Tulika, and hand back to Yonji.
Thank you so much. Faraz, I'll get started and you can just jump in and perhaps come in on the developers or LDC. I'll start not necessarily in the order in which you presented the questions, Martin. Really interesting questions. Thank you so much for asking that. I'll tackle the question on the adaptive capacity, RBPs for adaptive capacity first, and it's somewhat related to the a topic on service provider too. So an interesting problem with climate, the most distinctive feature of the problem with climate is that there is this giant externality. And in fact, I would argue, so that sort of makes it harder in the mitigation space to design RBPs, right? So you have to fix that extra externality. I would argue that in the adaptive capacity, there's a lot of relatability of applying RBPs because the most investments relating to improving adaptive capacity would also have private benefits. So it's just a matter of, either it's information, lack of information, or other types of constraints that might be limiting the adoption of those goods or services, which will improve adaptive capacity. Say climate services, it may not be immediately apparent why that's important, but if you have an RBP related to that, the users will immediately realize a benefit. So I think that it will have strong applicability there. And I'll just come in quickly on the service provider piece and then let Faraz jump in. On the issue of service provider, and it's a really important point. I want to say two things. One is incentivizing service providers will often mean incentivizing also the private sector. So thinking more broadly, that service providers are not your typical implementation entities, but also private sector can sort of have the attraction of bringing in private capital to this space. And vis-a-vis AMC versus pay for performance. So I think AMC traditionally and so far have been used largely for technology development. It's the idea is that you develop a technology, a new idea that doesn't exist, and we are going to give you a commitment to purchase that commodity. And you set the price for it to avoiding monopolistic pricing. And I think that if the intent is more on adoption and focus is more on adoption of technology and goods and services, then pay for performance does work well. And I would just say that it'd be worthwhile to think very carefully if it should be a single agent pay for P. So you see a lot of the pay for performance can be focused on single agent and you're paying them based on outcomes. But it's worthwhile to expand and see if a multiple actor pay for performance would make sense. Faraz, do you want to come in on the other two questions, and I can add?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Martin, thanks for kicking off a very interesting discussion. I'd say that there's perhaps two key ways in which evidence from low-income contexts and settings in relatively high-income countries can inform applications in actual low and middle-income countries. The first is to crystallize a really deep understanding of the kind of context-specific structure that's necessary to effectively deliver RBP interventions. So I'm thinking, for example, of a ton of evidence that we found of the deployment of vouchers in the education sector in North America. Now, the professed goal of deploying vouchers in a context such as this is to increase choice, the choice capacity of potential beneficiaries, giving families the option to choose the schools that they go to, giving families the option of making particular schools more affordable. That essentially assumes that there are enough schools around for households to be able to pick and choose. If that context-specific condition is lacking in a lower middle-income context, low and middle-income country context, that voucher may be less effective than it has been in the other contexts. The second way I think that evidence from a relatively high-income context can inform low and middle-income countries is by crystallizing a sense of what kinds of services and goods and services are incentivized. So for example, education services, as I mentioned in the previous example, is one, but a second domain within which we found that RBPs have been extensively deployed was the health sector, and in particular, pay-for-performance modalities in the health sector. Seeing successful examples of incentivizing medical service providers, incentivizing particular processes, incentivizing particular outputs, incentivizing the delivery of particular medical innovations generates insights as to what kinds of services, goods and services could be similarly incentivized in a context where RBPs have perhaps been less deployed. And with that, I'll stop there.
I think that the last question, Martin, you had about sort of expanding the use of RBPs within GCF itself. And I think that a few further next steps would be actually helpful before embarking on that. This is to try and understand, get a little bit deeper in the literature, to look at the relative effectiveness, get a little bit into sort of parsing out what Faraz was talking about, the applicability of some of the results in a developed country setting to a developing country setting, and then focusing on the outcomes that are GCF's priority, conducting a prospective analysis to understand which incentive structure, which type of RBP modality would be most effective. That usually requires some understanding of getting the lay of the land on who could be the service providers, who could be the entities to incentivize, what are their capacities, and that sort of helps determine whether a multiple actor a program would work well, or what type of outcomes one should incentivize, because it's really important to sort of align the actors to where you're getting. So you want to achieve sustainable outcomes, you want to incentivize service providers in a way that keeps them aligned, whether it's vis-a-vis their business interest or whether it's their service providing modality. Hopefully that was helpful, Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yonji, would you like me to respond to those?
Yeah, can you quickly respond? And then I do have a list of questions from the floor. So yeah, go ahead, Martin.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Tulika and Faraz, for the responses. I think this is a really interesting discussion. So the first point, just on advanced market commitments. So Tulika made the point that this is around often for technological innovation. And what we found within the adaptation portfolio is often it's forms of organizational or institutional innovation, which is most important for adaptation as opposed to technological innovation. So the question there is, can advanced market commitments be used to for those broader forms of kind of software innovation, as well as for technological types of innovation. The second response I'd just like to make is just on the pay for performance. So what seems very important there is that this incentivizes multiple agents, like Tulika said, but these agents aren't necessarily in competition. So there seems to be ample scope for pay for performance type financial modalities from the GCF to make sure that there are results-based payments. And then the third point I'd just like to highlight was just around vouchers, and vouchers and pay for performance are the two results-based payment modalities that come through most strongly in the review. But there's, as sort of I try to highlight, there's a limited extent to which these have been applied within adaptation areas. One area that we have seen the use of vouchers, for example, one of the hybrid interventions is through sort of fertilizer subsidies. So the sort of voucher-driven fertilizer subsidies, and that didn't come through very strongly within the evidence review. But I mean, that's in addition to health and education within the agricultural sector. That's been used quite widely in the last couple of decades, and it seems that there's sort of ample potential for that modality within adaptation as well. So I hope that's extended the discussion a little bit, and I'll hand back to Yonji.
Thank you very much, Martin. Okay, so let me get to these questions from the floor. The first question from Ben: any evidence related to the relative effectiveness of RBPs with stronger causality attribution between investments and results? And maybe I could add to that question Archie's question about which RBPs have been most effective, at least, what were the indications that you got from the study? Tulika, for us, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that I think not having looked into it, but still knowing the literature, there is pretty strong evidence on conditional cash transfer across the space, even for payment for environmental services, and on vouchers. I think that it's a question of probably magnitude, but the ones that are shoring up as areas where there is actually positive evidence are indeed very likely the places where there is actually a strong evidence. As you can imagine, you do have an intervention, it's successful, it engenders more interventions. And so that's where my guess is, and that's where my knowledge is. Faraz, do you want to add anything to that? I realized Ben had a question on how many studies actually had a causal attribution. I think that should be the majority, but for us, I think you should come in since you looked at the papers in a lot of detail.
Sure. Let me just caveat that by saying that this was not the purpose of the evidence review. While we do track the types of methods each individual study is using, the kinds of outcomes it's looking to incentivize, we did not conduct a meta-analysis. We didn't study the direction of the impact. We didn't conduct adjustments to account for different sample sizes across studies and so on. I'll agree with Tulika that the distribution of the evidence that you see on the evidence gap map, and indeed in the kind of sector-specific, domain-specific, actor-specific cuts of the evidence gap map that we conduct is probably the best place to begin looking for more detailed knowledge on what the underlying evidence is. We think this is a valuable next step because what the evidence gap map that we generated does is helps us highlight what the landscape currently looks like across different interventions and across different outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we have a lot of questions regarding RED+ RBPs. So could you confirm how you categorize the RED+ RBPs in your evidence gap map? And also, Eugene is asking, the GCF is financing based on the results that are already achieved in the past, but for non-RED+ RBP, it is financing the expected results in the future. So how did you account for that in your research? And then Caroline responded that Red Plus RBP is categorized as PES, which may be a bit of a stretch. So is it really a category on its own for so many reasons, including the one pointed out, or backwards and forwards looking? So how would you comment on these questions? Go ahead, Tulika.
Sure. Tulika, I can take that one. So Caroline is absolutely right. We do categorize Red Plus as PES. And Eugene's point on forward-looking and backward-looking incentive mechanisms is absolutely correct as well. Ultimately, at some point, each evidence gap map, each evidence review, each systematic review aims to delineate the scope of the activity, and the decision we made was that payments for environmental services would cover both types of mechanisms. That said, the data set that we do generate tracks individual studies and the kinds of mechanisms that they use. So technically, it is possible for us to be able to separate these at a later stage and look more closely at the ways in which the underlying Red Plus mechanism, the ways in which the underlying payments for environmental services mechanism is deployed.
Tulika, you want to add to that, or are we fine to move to another question?
I think we can move to the next point. I think you clarified it well.
So from Andreas, our head AI, so he would like to learn more about the unintended consequences of RBPs. And I also thought that was very, very interesting. Yeah. And in the paper, you mentioned, an example, which is, let's say, incentives were provided to switch to energy efficient technologies. But what if that leads to overuse? So can we discuss this unintended consequences? And I also remember that you mentioned creativity. Maybe it's not a major thing because we already kind of define what the desired outcome is, and yeah, obviously creativity is not a major concern. So could you comment on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing really important to say when we talk about unintended consequences is that somehow we always think about the negative ones, but as you said, creativity. So there is both potential for negative and positive unintended consequences. And the case of RBPs, and with the experience particularly coming in with, looking at the literature more deeply on this, just as an aside, this is an area where I think one needs to focus a lot on RBPs particularly. As I already mentioned, on the positive side, you can be looking at a lot of systemic positive influences. For example, I talked about the market creation influence. Like, for example, one of the ag results pilots that we did in Kenya, the market continues to sustain, private sector actors are coming in. So that's a huge value and benefit that you can get out of it. And then there are, for example, instances where technology development innovations have led to creativity in a realm that leads to other inventions. So like, for example, the recent vaccine development, which has been incentivized to some degree with some AMCs, has led to discovery of a new way of coming up with vaccines. So similarly, there have been many sort of situations where the creativity has led to spin-offs and benefits in other fields and other sectors and other outcomes that we were not anticipating. On the other hand, they can be negative unintended consequences. For example, with the grand challenge, I mentioned monopolistic pricing. There is when you're leaving the modality of how you achieve a certain outcome, therein can lie some sort of issues on how is it actually happening. Is it, is it happening in ways that is inclusive? Is it excluding certain entities? Is it leading to other kinds of issues related to overuse? Now, the most important thing is to recognize what is possible. So one of the things that we said as we were evaluating ag results and came to the conclusion is that very important to figure out all the different pathways and things, the way things will materialize. And the good thing is that in the RBP, then you can incorporate the unintended consequences in the incentive structure. So if you're concerned about overuse, you can cap the payments after a certain point. You can build in sort of assurances against the unintended consequences. So it's a matter of sort of doing a fair amount of prospective analysis, a lot of interviewing, talking to actors, understanding their motivations, and then building in those issues. So one simple example can be that if you're incentivizing the sale of a technology that is beneficial, but you want to target it to the poorest, well, anybody, how do you verify that the sales are actually going to the poorest? That is a heavy take. If you have to keep verifying that, then that's a hugely expensive RBP. However, then you could say, well, I'm going to focus the RBP and sales only in a certain region where I know the poverty rate is super high, or you could tailor the technology in such a way that specify the requirements of the technology in such a way that they are useful only to the poorest, like tiny pouches of, just as an example, or smaller on-farm storage bags. So there are ways to counter it. It's just a matter of thinking through what the possibilities are.
Faraz, you want to quickly comment on this aspect?
Sure. With respect to the evidence gap map that we generate in the learning paper, I think a key challenge of studying unintended consequences is that you as the researcher, you as the evaluator, really need to be acutely aware of the theoretical mechanisms of that particular RBP intervention that's being evaluated to even begin to consider the unintended ways in which outcomes might be achieved. So Yonji, I really appreciate you raising the example from the learning paper about the use of energy technologies. That was an example from a study in Cambodia that was seeking to provide results-based payments to incentivize use of improved cooking technologies by households. And what households ended up doing was using these technologies more than they should have, cooking more than they previously did, which essentially nullified any energy efficiency benefits, energy emissions benefits that we might have achieved. These kinds of outcomes, these kinds of behavioral responses are not very easy to detect ex ante, to predict ex ante. And I wouldn't be surprised that many of the studies that we're looking at for this learning paper also have unintended consequences, which are just not being tracked by the relevant authors of those publications.
Thank you for that. So I actually had a question. The RBPs, the topic itself, I wasn't too familiar with it before I read the paper. And I was curious about this money aspect. So who decides what's the right amount of money to be paid to agents? And do actors and donors get to negotiate the price? And what happens if the donors, for whatever reasons, renege on paying, the agents for the desired outcomes?
Right. So I think you've touched upon a very important topic in the design of RBPs, which is actually a tricky topic. It does require some art, but it does have some science to it. So there's a small blog post that I wrote around it related to that, because there were some instances where it felt like some of the prices were too large. So a way to get around it is to do a prospective analysis. Again, I keep speaking about that because it actually is very, very important. Is to understand what level of adoption would lead to what level of benefits. And you surely don't want to set up a total pot price, which will be more than the benefits that you would achieve in a reasonable scenario. So one piece is the pot of, the pot that you will distribute from. The next thing is, well, how will you determine how that pot is shared or divided? So am I going to do a proportional price based on effort? Am I going to give just a grant, take that entire pot of money and give it to one actor? And there are multiple considerations that come in. One, you have to have a very good sense of the business model or whatever financial underpinnings are with the sector, with this entity that you're incentivizing, so that they will actually find that payment exciting and would participate and will invest their resources or put in the effort towards the particular outcome. You also want to look at what kind of final service provider space that you're looking for. Do you want lots of people engaged in it, or do you want a few eclectic actors which can veer you between proportional price, which will have many more actors, versus a grand price? And there's also a per unit price where you're really limiting the competition and saying that you're going to pay per unit for everything that you achieve. Now that per unit payment will have to be exactly priced around what is an appropriate price for that commodity, or what's the appropriate premium for that kind of commodity. So there's a lot of art and science to it, and it's a very fascinating topic, and then more needs to be written and said about that actually than there is.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps I can direct this last question to Martin, if I may. So Martin, you were also one of the authors of this paper. Would you expect to see different effectiveness of RBPs in North America and other contexts? So if you could answer that question. And also, if you could tell us what your plan is for this learning paper. Is there more review, meta-analysis that you're going to do after this, or what's your plan? Yeah.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Yonji. And you're directing the question around the kind of applicability of the North American evidence to the right person, because when we were scoping out this study, we realized quite early on that a lot of the sort of causal evidence is based in non-Annex 1 contexts, and the most important thing was to see the landscape of studies between interventions and outcomes, and that's what we've clearly got in the EGM, and it's extremely valuable. And just to reiterate Tulika's point previously, the institutional setting within which these instruments are put in play is critical. So there's a need for sort of formative research to see how they can be applied in different contexts. Absolutely. I mean, in terms of next steps, yes, there is scope for meta-analysis. We can see in the EGM there are cells that have critical mass of studies, but what we need to be, the first step there is to make sure that the interventions and outcomes are identical. And then once we have for example, if we have more than a dozen or so studies in a very, very specific sort of subcell, if you like, we would be able to do meta-analysis, and would increase the sample size, and that would reduce the confidence intervals around impact estimates. So that is the next step. Absolutely, yes. And then the final point I'd just like to sort of highlight from, at least from my own perspective, is just that the evidence review shows really, really clearly that for those key sectors that the GCF is investing in for adaptation, for the water sector, and for climate information services and early warning systems, there doesn't seem to be any evidence, causal or non-causal, on the effectiveness of results-based payments. So this is an area that needs further investigation. This is an evidence gap, and this needs further investigation. And in addition to that, the use of results-based payments in agriculture outside of payment for environmental services, that's another area which should be of great interest to the GCF. So I hope I've covered the questions there. And back to you, Yonji.
Thank you, Martin, very much. So I know we've exhausted our time for this talk, but maybe we could answer this question about monitoring. So in the event that monitoring data is not easily available, would there be any additional funding or grant funding to support the gathering of data? Tulika, for us? Yeah.
So I wasn't sure, are we talking about the monitoring data related to a verification of RBPs? Is that what the question is, Safira?
I believe so. Yeah, this question is from Zafira, and I think, yeah, yes.
Oh, okay, yes, yes. Actually, the verification and the cost of verification are borne by the entity that sort of launches the RBP. So it is not obviously the responsibility of the actors who are involved in it. So I think that what happens with RBP is that your outlay of the funding changes significantly. So where you have a lot of management costs related to managing the day-to-day outputs of an entity, you're simply spending most of your time designing the RBP really well, and then spending time verifying, which has to be a third-party entity that has to be contracted with everybody understand what they are reviewing. So your resources from the typical M&E resources get diverted to the verification, and your management cost during the competition or during the RBP reduces. So there is a slight difference in allocation, but verification is extremely critical. I know we didn't end up talking too much about it. You have to have your outcomes such that they are verifiable without any doubt, and that all parties will agree to the results of the verification for an RBP to work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And very lastly, there was this comment about the behavioral aspects when we design RBPs, and then when we also discussed the unintended consequences, you touched upon the behavioral aspects. And so could you perhaps quickly comment on this aspect? Maybe, I don't know, Faraz, do you want to take this question? Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, let there be no doubt about it. RBPs are an incentive mechanism. Whenever incentives are in play, the responses of targeted actors can be unpredictable. And I'm not going to say that it's always possible to predict exactly how behavioral actions will play out, but it's absolutely crucial to keep them really, in focus as the RBP intervention is being designed. Because if you don't, then you're essentially ensuring that unintended consequences, negative unintended consequences especially, will play out. I'm happy to chat further about this offline.
Okay, thank you very much for that. If there are no more questions, then I think we can close the talk here. I will ask Beatrice to put up the closing slides, and many, many thanks to our wonderful speakers, presenters, and discussant today. So yes, yes, thank you very much. So we would like to just highlight a few IEU communications products. At the IEU, we have many prolific writers and thinkers, and we do publish these shorter blogs as a means to share our learning and experience. And so the latest blog is titled, Race Against Time, Machine Learning for the Climate Emergency, written by Helen Nasuna, who is our Data Lab intern. So please go check it out. It's a very interesting read. Next, please. And then the IEU has its own podcast series called The Evaluator. And so our latest episode focuses on the UNEP's Global Environment Outlook Report, the 6th GEO report, and especially the findings from the freshwater chapter. So please subscribe to our podcast and then perhaps, listen to it. It's really nice. And next, please. And again, as I mentioned, our talk today featured the recently concluded IEU evidence review on RBPs, and here it is. You can get access to the report again for your in-depth reading. So with that, I would like to close this talk. We hope to see you again soon. We do plan to organize another virtual talk in March. We think that the date will be March 25. And given the fact that March is the Women's History Month, we want to organize a talk on the topic of gender empowerment and in the space of climate change, carbon finance. So do join us, and thank you very much for joining us today. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.